This is another sign of the times, an analysis and a commentary. New report on Iranian nuke. Over the past several weeks, neoconservative hawks were predicting that the International Atomic Energy Agency's new report on Iran's nuclear program would provide the spark needed to ignite and justify a U.S. or Israeli attack. But the new report did no such thing, and the issue has been overshadowed by other stories. In fact, there was so little new in the IAEA report that Iran experts who had been scheduled to do media spots discussing the issue were told not to bother coming in. The Penn State cover-up, the Herman Cain sexual harassment scandal, and now the Rick Perry brain freeze would continue to dominate the news cycle. Of course, this does not mean that the Iran nuclear threat has passed, only that the IAEA did not demonstrate that it has intensified. Yes, Iran is taking steps that indicate clear interest in developing nuclear weapons, but neither the IAEA nor anyone else knows if the Iranian regime intends to develop weapons, how long it will take to develop them, or what its nuclear posture would be if it had the bomb. For 30 years or so, various experts have predicted that Iran would have nuclear weapons in a year, 5 years, or whenever, with the date always receding into the horizon. The IAEA report doesn't offer much clarification. As a senior U.S. government official said in a conference call with reporters, the IAEA does not assert that Iran has resumed a full-scale nuclear weapons program, nor does it have a program about how advanced the programs really are. Of course, the usual suspects claim to know, just as they claim to know that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction that would someday produce Condoleezza Rice's infamous mushroom cloud over Washington. And those same suspects agree about what needs to be done to deter Iran from developing nuclear weapons. As with Iraq, the answer is preventive war, sooner rather than later. It's a case of what Yogi Berra called deja vu all over again. In other words, Iran seems to be a diversion from the real threats. And the real threat would seem to be Pakistani nukes. Because they don't have just one, they have some 100 of them. And the Taliban are not in Iran, they're in Pakistan. Some people say it is amazing that the same gang of people that led us into the disastrous war in Iraq, a war that has resulted in at least 4,471 Americans and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi dead, would have any credibility at all as they seek to get us involved in yet another Middle East war. But apparently, some people still take these war hawk neocons seriously. After all, if it weren't for them, no one here would be contemplating another war in the Middle East, one far more dangerous than the other two. In fact, it is impossible to find a single politician or journalist advocating war with Iran who is not a neocon or an AIPAC cutout. They're often both. And even when not specifically advocating war, they ratchet up the tension by predicting it, as if, by definition, an Iran with or on the verge of developing nuclear weapons means war. This obviously has not been the case with the 7 other nations that have gone nuclear since the United States bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, or at least not so far. The leader of the Iran war claque is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who, in the words of New Yorker editor David Remnick, has most heightened the sense of anxiety with a series of leaked reports that Israel is increasingly determined to launch a unilateral attack on Iranian nuclear faculties, with or without Obama's assent. Remnick writes, Israel's most influential columnist has written a commentary recently called Atomic Pressure, slamming Netanyahu and Defense Minister Barak for acting dangerously and without a thorough public discussion. The writer tried to describe the Prime Minister's thinking. Ahmadinejad is Hitler. If he isn't stopped in time, there will be another Holocaust. He continued, there are those who describe the Prime Minister's attitude on the matter as an obsession. All his life he has dreamed of being like Churchill. Iran gives him the opportunity. The writer also says Netanyahu is obsessed with the Second World War parallels, real or imagined, and even used them to justify his opposition to the peace process with the Palestinians in the 90s. The Israeli Prime Minister is deeply influenced not only by his 100-year-old father's right-wing revisionist ideology, but also by a profound sense of himself as Israel's post-Holocaust protector. Heroic imagery, like the F-15s flying over the rail tracks to Auschwitz, is no small part of what drives him. 5 years ago, he said of the Iranian nuclear issue, the year is 1938 and Iran is Germany. The Prime Minister's so-called hysteria about Iran and his repeated threats to attack its nuclear faculties would, if the shoe was on the other foot, almost surely cause Israel to preemptively attack Iran. In other words, repeatedly threatening Iran is very dangerous business. The journalist Jeff Goldberg, one of the most outspoken advocates of invading Iraq in 2003, wrote this week about Iran. The Israeli case for preemption is compelling and has been for some time. The leaders of Iran are eliminationist anti-Semites, men who for reasons of theology view the state of the Jews as a cancer. They have repeatedly called for Israel's destruction and worked to hasten that end, mainly by providing material support and training to two organizations, Hamas and Hezbollah, that specializes in the slaughter of innocent Jews. Iran's leaders are men who deny the Holocaust while promising another. Obviously, this kind of language is designed to ensure that there is no dialogue, that, in fact, the enemy is Hitler, always Hitler, and it's always 1938. But it's not 1938. Iran is not Nazi Germany, and Israel, with at least 200 air, land, and sea-based nuclear missiles, is nothing like the Jewish communities of Europe that, without weapons or allies, were annihilated by Nazi Germany. As a former Mossad chief put it recently, the state of Israel cannot be destroyed by an Iranian attack, but an Israeli attack on Iran would produce turmoil in the region for 100 years. To put it simply, an attack on Iran by Israel or the United States would embroil the Middle East in war, threaten the world's oil supply and the global economy, likely unleash a massive missile attack by Hezbollah on Israel, jeopardize some 100,000 U.S. troops in the Middle East, solidify the Iranian regime's waning support among the population, and still only delay the Iranian nuclear program by possibly a few years. Would that not be called insanity? So what's to be done about Iran? An attack will not deter whatever motivation Iranians may have for a nuclear bomb. In fact, an attack is very likely to ensure that the Iranians do get a bomb, to protect themselves from future attacks, and further sanctions, which AIPAC has made a litmus test for campaign support, will only hurt ordinary Iranian citizens without affecting Iran's nuclear program. So, there's only one way to deal with Iran, and it is the one we have never tried: unconditional, comprehensive negotiations. Some say no, not the kind of baby step talks both sides occasionally propose, but real negotiations that put everything on the table: Iran's nuclear program, Israel's refusal to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, Iran's threats against Israel and its unremitting hostility to it, Iranian support for terrorist groups, U.S. attempts to overthrow the Iranian regime, and our support for the assassination of its civilian scientists, and finally, Iran's role in Iraq and Afghanistan. So they say only comprehensive negotiations will end the Iran crisis without plunging the region and possibly the world into more war. Only successful comprehensive negotiations can provide both Israel and Iran with the confidence to get off a course that could lead to mutual destruction. Nothing else will work, and everything else has been tried. There is no alternative to diplomacy, period. Perhaps in this case, what Ron Paul says is right. This too is another sign of the times, the end times, transition days, which is a time of extraordinary happenings, events, and changes. Everything is connected, and everything is numbered. It's also called fate or destiny. It's also about what kind of world are we leaving to the future generations. Mark chapter 13, verse 14. But when ye shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not be, let him that reads or hear understand. Then let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains. 15. And let him that is on the housetop not go down into the house, neither enter therein to take anything out of his house. 16. And let him that is in the field not turn back again, for to take up his garment. 17. But woe to them that are with child, and to them that give nurse in those days. 18. And pray ye that your flight be not in the winter. 19. For in those days shall be affliction, such as was not from the beginning of the creation which God created unto this time, neither shall be. 20. And except that the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh should be saved. But for the elect's sake, whom he has chosen, he has shortened the days. It's time for all these prophecies to be fulfilled. Everything that must change quickly or rapidly, and for the better. And all these are more signs.